A racist cop laughs at a black girl until her Hell's Angel father arrives. It starts on a quiet afternoon when a young black woman is stopped on the street by a cop who should protect her, but instead destroys her bike, mocks her in front of children, and leaves her shaking in fear. She runs home to the one person who has always kept her safe, a gentle, soft-spoken single father who spent years hiding the life he used to live. But when he sees what that cop did to his daughter, something deep inside him wakes up, because that cop wasn't acting alone. There's a secret group hiding behind badges, men who have been hurting families for years, and now they've targeted her. As her father reaches out to old riders who still owe him everything, a storm begins to form, one powerful enough to shake an entire town. But the real question isn't about the danger waiting for them. It's this: when a peaceful father is pushed too far, how far will he go to protect the only family he has left? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalks of Cedar Grove as Zahara Carter wheeled her blue bicycle out of the garage. She paused to breathe in the crisp autumn air, adjusting the canvas bag of worksheets slung across her shoulder. The neighborhood was peaceful at this hour, just the way she liked it. Zahara smiled, noting how the maple trees along Oak Street had begun their annual transformation, their leaves turning brilliant shades of orange and gold. The quiet moments before school were precious to her, a time when she could gather her thoughts and prepare for the day ahead. As she pedaled toward Oak Ridge Elementary, Mrs. Johnson from next door waved from her porch. "Good morning, dear," the elderly woman called out. Zahara waved back, her naturally warm smile brightening her face. These small exchanges were the heartbeat of their community, and she treasured each one. Arriving at school 20 minutes early, Zahara locked her bike in the rack and noticed a small group of students already gathered near the entrance. "Miss Carter! Miss Carter!" called out Tommy Rodriguez, a fourth grader with untied shoelaces and an ever-present grin. "I finished that book you lent me." "That's wonderful, Tommy." Zahara knelt down to help him with his shoelaces. "What did you think about the ending?" As Tommy launched into an enthusiastic recap, other students drifted over. Zahara listened attentively, asking questions and sharing in their excitement about upcoming projects. This was why she loved teaching, these precious moments of connection that made each child feel seen and valued. The school day passed quickly, filled with spelling worksheets, math problems, and the 100 small victories that made up a teacher's day. As the final bell rang, Zahara gathered her things, thinking about the stack of papers waiting to be graded. She'd tackle them after dinner, maybe with a cup of her favorite chamomile tea. The afternoon sun was warm on her face as she unlocked her bike. She was halfway home when she heard the sharp chirp of a police siren behind her. Confused, Zahara pulled to the side of the road, her heart beginning to race despite knowing she'd done nothing wrong. The police cruiser's door opened with a heavy creak. Officer Trent Maddox emerged, his boots scraping against the asphalt as he approached. Zahara had never seen him before, but something in his stance made her stomach tighten. "License and registration," he demanded without preamble, his voice carrying a note of contempt that made Zahara's skin crawl. "I'm sorry, officer," she replied carefully, keeping her voice steady. "But I'm just riding my bicycle. I don't need—" "Don't tell me what you need," he cut her off, moving closer. "Look at you, dressed up like you're somebody important. Who do you think you are, riding around on this piece of junk?" Zahara's cheeks burned. She was wearing what she always wore to school, a simple blouse and skirt, professional and modest. Across the street, she could see several of her students watching, their faces worried. She wanted to tell them to go home, to not watch this, but she didn't dare speak. Officer Maddox circled her bike, his lip curled in disgust. "This thing isn't street legal," he declared, though the bike was in perfect condition with all required reflectors and lights. "Sir, I've been riding this route to school for 3 years," Zahara tried to explain, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never had any problems." The sound of metal striking pavement cut her off. Officer Maddox had knocked her bike over, and before she could react, he drew out his pocket knife. The sharp blade glinted in the afternoon sun as he methodically punctured her tires, the hiss of escaping air seeming to last forever. "Maybe now you'll learn to get proper transportation," he sneered, grabbing her bike and hurling it into the middle of the road. The frame twisted as it hit the asphalt, the handlebar bell giving one final, pathetic ding. Zahara stood frozen, feeling the sting of tears behind her eyes, but refusing to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him, not in front of her students, who were still watching with horror from across the street. Her arm throbbed where she'd instinctively tried to catch herself when he'd knocked the bike over. Officer Maddox got back in his cruiser without another word, leaving Zahara to retrieve her mangled bike from the road. Her hands shook as she gripped the twisted handlebars, trying to wheel it toward home. The metal frame scraped against the ground, the flat tires making each step a struggle. The walk home seemed endless. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, but no one came to help. Zahara kept her head down, focused on putting one foot in front of the other, holding herself together until she could reach the safety of home. When she finally pushed open their front gate, her father Malik was working in the garden. One look at her face, and he was on his feet, moving toward her with quiet purpose. His eyes took in everything: the ruined bike, her trembling hands, the bruise already forming on her arm. Malik Carter was a man who had learned to keep his emotions in check, to present a calm face to the world. But as he looked at his daughter now, something shifted in his expression. His jaw tightened in a way Zahara had never seen before, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of someone else beneath her gentle father's exterior. Someone harder, someone dangerous. But his touch was soft as he helped her inside, settling her on the living room couch. He knelt beside her, his strong hands gentle as he wiped away the tears she could no longer hold back. "Tell me everything," he said quietly, and though his voice was tender, there was a storm gathering behind his eyes. Zahara looked at her father, seeing both the man she knew and someone else, someone from a past he never talked about. Her voice trembled as she began to speak, telling him about Officer Maddox, about the cruel words and casual violence, about her students watching helplessly from across the street. As she spoke, Malik remained still, listening intently, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, could see the careful way he controlled his breathing. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as Zahara finished her story. Her father hadn't interrupted once, hadn't moved except to hold her hand when her voice threatened to break. Now he reached up and brushed away a fresh tear from her cheek, his touch as gentle as ever, even as that quiet storm continued to build in his eyes. The kitchen filled with the gentle whistle of the kettle as Malik prepared chamomile tea, his movements deliberate and controlled. He'd always found peace in these small rituals, but tonight his hands betrayed the slightest tremor as he poured the steaming water into Zahara's favorite mug, the one with tiny painted flowers that her students had given her last year. "Let me look at that arm, baby girl," he said softly, setting the tea down on the coffee table. Zahara winced slightly as he examined the bruise, now a deep purple against her brown skin. His touch was gentle, but she could feel the tension in his fingers. "It's not too bad, Dad," she assured him. though they both knew that wasn't the point. Malik's only response was a slight tightening around his eyes as he arranged a throw pillow behind her back. "You rest here. I'll handle dinner tonight." Throughout the evening meal of reheated lasagna, Zahara noticed how her father seemed distracted, pushing food around his plate more than eating it. After cleaning up, he began pacing the kitchen, his footsteps echoing against the worn linoleum. In the soft glow of the overhead light, he looked different, older somehow, with shadows under his eyes she'd never noticed before. There was something haunted in his expression that made her heart ache. Sleep proved elusive that night. Zahara tossed and turned, her mind replaying the afternoon's events on an endless loop. The sound of her bike hitting the pavement, the hiss of air from her slashed tires, the helpless faces of her students watching from across the street. The next morning, she woke before dawn, earlier than usual. The house was quiet, except for a low murmur coming from downstairs. Curious, she crept down the hallway, staying close to the wall where the floorboards were less likely to creak. Her father's voice drifted up from the kitchen, but it was unlike anything she'd ever heard from him before. Gone was his usual gentle tone, replaced by something hard and commanding. "I need everything you can get on him," Malik was saying, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying an authority that made Zahara shiver. "Badge number, patrol routes, personal details, all of it. And Jake, this stays quiet, real quiet." There was a pause as he listened to the response. "Yeah, I know it's been 15 years, but you owe me, brother. We all made it out because—" He stopped abruptly, having caught sight of Zahara standing in the doorway. The phone slipped slightly in his grip as their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. The morning light streaming through the kitchen window caught the silver in Malik's hair, highlighting how tired he looked. "Who were you talking to?" Zahara asked quietly, though something in her stomach told her she might not want to know the answer. Malik slowly set the phone down on the counter. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, there was a resignation in his expression that made him look suddenly vulnerable. "Sit down, baby girl," he said softly. "There are some things I need to tell you." They settled at the kitchen table, steam rising from fresh cups of coffee between them. Malik's hands were wrapped around his mug, but he wasn't drinking. "Before you were born," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of long-buried memories, "I was someone else, someone called Hellhound." Zahara felt her breath catch. She'd heard that name before, whispered in certain parts of town with a mixture of respect and fear. "I led a chapter of the Hells Angels," Malik continued, watching her face carefully. "Was good at it, too. Too good, maybe. We weren't always on the right side of the law, but we had a code, protected our own." He paused, taking a sip of coffee that must have gone cold. "When your mama died, I knew I had to change. You were so small, so perfect. I couldn't risk leaving you alone in the world, so I walked away from all of it. Built us a different life." Zahara sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man she knew, the father who taught her to garden, who still checked under her bed for monsters well into her teenage years, who cried at her college graduation. "All those business trips when I was little?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Meetings with old contacts, making sure we stayed safe while I transitioned out," he admitted. "It's not easy to leave that life behind. Had to do it right, or it could have followed us." Tears welled in Zahara's eyes. "Why are you telling me this now?" Malik reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Because things are changing, baby girl. What happened yesterday? That's not right. And sometimes—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes you need old skills to fight new battles." The day passed in a blur as Zahara tried to process this new reality. She caught her father watching her throughout the afternoon, concern evident in his eyes. As night fell, he disappeared into the attic, returning with a metal box she'd never seen before. The box made a heavy sound as he set it on the dining table. Malik stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on the lid, lost in thought. Without a word, he reached over and turned off the lights, leaving the box sitting in darkness. The early morning sun filtered through the kitchen curtains, casting long shadows across the dining room table where the metal box sat open. Zahara paused in the doorway, her heart skipping a beat at the sight of her father sitting there, staring at its contents. Inside lay a weathered leather vest, what bikers called a cut, adorned with patches that spoke of a life she'd never known. The leather was cracked in places, telling stories of long rides and hard years. Beside it sat an old flip phone and various patches, their colors still vivid despite the years. "Come sit, baby girl," Malik said without looking up. His voice was heavy with concern. "Got a call last night that changes things." Zahara slid into the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "What kind of call?" "Jake, one of my old brothers. He's been keeping tabs on certain things for me over the years." Malik picked up one of the patches, running his thumb over the embroidered edge. "That officer who hurt you? Trent Maddox? He's not just a bad cop with a power problem. He's part of something bigger." A chill ran down Zahara's spine as her father continued. "There's a militia, white supremacists, that's been working its way into the police force for years. Jake says Maddox is one of their key players." Malik finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and fear. "Baby, I think you were targeted. They might have known exactly who you are, who I was." Zahara felt the room spin slightly. "But that doesn't make sense. I'm just a substitute teacher. I've never done anything to—" "Sometimes just existing is enough for people like that," Malik said softly. "But we're going to do this right first. If you want to file a report, I'll take you down there myself." "I have to," Zahara insisted, straightening her shoulders. "If nobody ever speaks up, nothing will change." Malik nodded slowly, carefully returning the items to the box. "Then let's go." The drive to the police station was silent. Zahara could feel waves of tension rolling off her father as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors. He'd taught her to always follow the rules, to trust in the system, but now she understood the cost of those lessons, how much faith he'd had to place in a world that hadn't always been kind to them. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Zahara approached the front desk. The officer there barely glanced up from his computer, his expression bored and dismissive. Malik stood a few steps behind her, a quiet guardian, as she recounted the incident with Officer Maddox. "Fill these out," the desk officer said, sliding some forms across the counter. "Someone will contact you." Zahara's hand trembled slightly as she filled out each line, describing how her bike had been destroyed, how she'd been humiliated in front of her students. The officer took the completed forms with the same disinterest, barely acknowledging her "thank you." That evening, sitting at their kitchen table over untouched plates of dinner, Zahara tried to hold on to her optimism. "Maybe this will make a difference," she said. "Maybe doing the right thing will matter." Malik didn't respond, just reached across the table and squeezed her hand. The next morning, the phone rang early. Zahara answered, recognition dropping like a stone in her stomach as she heard the dismissive voice of the desk officer from yesterday. "Ms. Carter, we've reviewed your complaint, but we're unable to locate any report in our system. Are you sure you filed one?" Zahara's legs gave out, and she sank onto the couch. "Yes, I'm sure. I was there yesterday. You were the one who gave me the forms. Sorry, ma'am. Nothing in the system. You're welcome to come file a new report if you'd like. The line went dead before she could respond. From the kitchen came the sound of wood creaking. Malik stood gripping the back of a chair, his knuckles white with tension. Without a word, he walked to the front door, stepping out onto the porch. Through the window, Zahara watched as he pulled out the old flip phone from yesterday. His fingers moved deliberately over the keypad, dialing a number that seemed to physically pain him to call. As he raised the phone to his ear, Zahara could see the weight of 15 years of peace beginning to crack, old loyalties stirring like wolves waking from a long sleep. The midday sun cast long shadows across Malik's auto repair shop as, one by one, motorcycles rumbled into the gravel lot behind the house. Zahara watched through the kitchen window, her breath fogging the glass. These men, with their weathered leather jackets and gray-streaked beards, moved with a deliberate purpose she'd never seen before. Each rider dismounted with practiced ease, removing their helmets to reveal faces lined with years of hard living. Yet when they approached Malik, their demeanor shifted. They didn't swagger or posture. Instead, they greeted him with quiet nods and respectful handshakes, like soldiers reuniting with their former commander. Through the partially open window, fragments of conversation drifted in. "It's been too long, Hellhound," one rider said, his voice gruff but warm. "Wish it was under better circumstances, Jake," Malik replied, clasping the man's shoulder. The riders gathered in a loose circle, their faces growing serious as Malik spoke. Zahara couldn't hear everything, but phrases like militia infiltration and gathering evidence carried clearly enough. When one rider mentioned Officer Maddox, several others spat on the ground in disgust. "They're using badges to hide their hate," Jake said, his voice rising with anger. "It's a cancer eating this town from the inside." The others nodded grimly. One by one, they pledged their support, offering resources, connections, and most importantly, their loyalty to the man who had once led them through darker times. Zahara pulled away from the window, her heart heavy but determined. She refused to let fear paralyze her. Instead, she gathered her teaching materials and headed to Oak Ridge Elementary, arriving early to set up for her afternoon classes. During her last period, she noticed Tommy, a usually bright-eyed third grader, looking withdrawn. After class, she gently asked him to stay behind. "Is everything okay?" she asked, sitting beside him. Tommy's lower lip trembled. "Some kids were making fun of my accent again. Said I should go back where I came from." Zahara's heart clenched. "Would you like to talk about it? Actually." She paused, an idea forming. "Would you maybe like to be part of a special after-school group?" That afternoon, Zahara held her first support circle. 5 students stayed behind, sitting cross-legged on colorful reading cushions. Tommy was there, along with Maria, whose lunch was often mocked for being weird, and 3 others who had faced similar treatment. "This is a safe space," Zahara explained, her voice soft but steady. "Here, we can talk about anything that's bothering you. We can share our stories, our feelings, and know that we're not alone." The children were hesitant at first, but Zahara's gentle encouragement soon had them opening up. They shared their experiences, their fears, and their hopes. When Maria started crying while describing how lonely she felt, Tommy offered her his favorite pencil. The simple gesture of kindness brought a warm smile to Zahara's face. "Sometimes," she told them, "the bravest thing we can do is be kind to each other, even when others aren't kind to us." By the time parents arrived to pick up their children, the group had formed a tight bond. Each child hugged Zahara before leaving, clinging to her with a desperation that spoke of their need for understanding and acceptance. When Zahara returned home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. The motorcycles were still parked behind the shop, their chrome reflecting the fading light. Inside, she found Malik and his riders gathered around the dining room table, which was covered with maps, notes, and photographs. Jake was pointing to something on one of the maps. "We've identified 3 locations where they might be holding meetings, if we can get solid evidence of their activities." Malik noticed Zahara in the doorway and quickly stood up. "Give us a minute," he told the riders, leading Zahara into the kitchen. "Baby, I need you to understand something," he said, his voice low and intense. "What we're doing here, it's just gathering information, evidence we can take to the right authorities. This isn't about going back to my old life." Zahara studied her father's face, noting the familiar signs of worry in the crease between his eyebrows, the tightness around his mouth. "Dad?" "I promise you," he continued, taking her hands in his, "this won't swallow up everything we've built. Our peaceful life, that's still what matters most." But Zahara could see the lie in his eyes, not meant to deceive her, but to protect her, and maybe himself, from a truth he wasn't ready to face. The quiet man who fixed cars and helped her with homework was being pulled back into a world of shadows and steel, drawn by the need to protect not just his daughter, but everything they stood for. As night fell, the riders departed one by one, their motorcycles growling into the darkness. Zahara tried to stay awake, curled up on the living room couch with a book she wasn't really reading. But exhaustion eventually won out, and she drifted off to sleep. Outside, Malik stood alone in the darkness of his backyard. The moon cast enough light to silhouette his broad shoulders, now straight and squared in a way they hadn't been in years. His eyes scanned the horizon, not really seeing the distant city lights, but looking instead toward an approaching storm only he could sense. In that moment, he wasn't the gentle father who braided his daughter's hair, or the skilled mechanic who hummed while he worked. He was becoming something else, something he'd buried 15 years ago. A warrior preparing for battle, knowing that peace was already a casualty of a war he never wanted to fight. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Malik slipped out of the house, his old leather jacket hanging loose on his frame. 2 motorcycles waited in the driveway. Jake and Rico, trusted brothers from his past life, sat astride their bikes with the practiced stillness of men who knew how to watch without being seen. "Remember," Malik said quietly, climbing into his pickup truck, "we're just running errands. Keep it casual." The 3 vehicles spread out, maintaining careful distance as they cruised through town. Malik's truck, weathered and unremarkable, blended perfectly with morning traffic. He'd chosen it years ago for exactly this reason. It was forgettable, the kind of vehicle that disappeared into the background of daily life. At the corner of Oak and Main, Malik spotted Officer Maddox's patrol car. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his face remained neutral. Through his earpiece, Jake's voice crackled. "Got eyes on 2 more. Black SUV, tinted windows heading east on Palmer." Meanwhile, across town, Zahara's classroom had become more than just a place of learning. Children who once sat silent now gathered around her desk during lunch, sharing stories they'd never dared tell before. Maria brought her mother's homemade tamales, proudly sharing them with the other students. Tommy taught everyone words in his native language, beaming with pride instead of shame. During afternoon dismissal, an elderly woman approached Zahara. Her grandson, Marcus, held her hand tightly. "Miss Carter?" The grandmother's voice wavered. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" They sat together on a bench while Marcus played nearby. The grandmother's hands trembled as she spoke. "I've been raising Marcus since his mama passed. It hasn't been easy. Some of the teachers..." She paused, wiping her eyes. They look at him different. Treat him different. But he comes home talking about your class, about how you listen to him, how you make him feel like he matters. Tears rolled down the grandmother's weathered cheeks. You're the first teacher who's made my boy feel safe, really safe. He smiles now, actually smiles. Zahara reached out, squeezing the older woman's hand. Her throat felt tight with emotion. Marcus is a wonderful child. He deserves to feel safe and valued. All our children do. The grandmother pulled Zahara into a fierce hug. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for seeing him. As the afternoon wore on, Malik and his riders continued their surveillance. They watched Maddox meet with other officers in parking lots, observed unmarked cars entering an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Each movement was carefully noted, each pattern mapped. By evening, Malik's shoulders carried the weight of everything he'd seen. He walked through his front door just as Zahara was setting the table for dinner. The familiar smell of her vegetable curry filled the kitchen, a reminder of simpler days. How was your day? Zahara asked, trying to keep her voice light and normal. Malik managed a small smile. Quiet, just routine maintenance work. The lie tasted bitter, but he forced himself to continue. Had to order some parts for Mrs. Johnson's Buick. They sat together, sharing their meal and small stories. Zahara told him about Marcus and his grandmother, carefully avoiding mention of why such a conversation had been necessary. Malik spoke about a funny incident with a customer's cat that had happened last week. Not today. They were both trying so hard to pretend everything was normal, to preserve this precious ritual of family dinner. But the tension hummed beneath their words like an electrical current, impossible to ignore completely. After dinner, Zahara hugged her father extra tight before heading upstairs to bed. I love you, Dad, she whispered. Love you too, baby girl, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Once he heard her bedroom door close, Malik pulled out the maps he'd been collecting. He spread them across the dining room table, marking locations with different colored pins. Red for confirmed militia meeting spots, blue for suspected locations, yellow for places they'd observed suspicious activity. The pattern was becoming clearer and more disturbing. The militia's influence spread through the police department like poison through veins, touching every precinct, every neighborhood. Looking at the evidence before him, Malik whispered into the quiet room. I will not let them hurt her again. His voice carried the weight of both promise and threat. The back door opened silently, admitting Jake, Rico, and 3 other riders. They moved like shadows, their boots barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. Each man carried notebooks filled with observations, photographs taken from safe distances, lists of license plate numbers and meeting times. They gathered around the table. These men who had once been the most feared motorcycle club in 3 states, now using their skills not for profit or power, but to protect a teacher who dared to show kindness in a world that had forgotten how. The midnight planning session began in whispers, each man aware of the sleeping woman upstairs who had no idea her father's quiet auto shop had become the command center for an operation that would either save their community or tear it apart. Over the next 3 days, something remarkable began happening at Oak Ridge Elementary. Zahara's after-school support circle, which had started with just 5 hesitant students, grew like a garden tended with care and patience. Word spread among the children. Here was a safe place, a teacher who listened. By Wednesday afternoon, 20 young faces filled her classroom. They sat in a circle, some on chairs, others cross-legged on the bright carpet. Their voices, initially whispered and uncertain, grew stronger as they shared their stories. Jimmy called me names because of my hijab, said Amira, a 4th grader with bright eyes. But Miss Carter taught me that being different is beautiful. The sixth graders were pushing me around, Marcus added, his voice steady now where it once would have trembled. Miss Carter helped me tell the principal. They don't bother me anymore. Zahara watched them support each other, offering words of encouragement and small gestures of friendship. These children, who had once felt so alone, were becoming each other's defenders. Parents began lingering after dismissal, approaching Zahara with grateful smiles and sometimes tears in their eyes. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose daughter Elena had barely spoken in class before, joining the circle, hugged Zahara tightly one afternoon. Elena talks about you at dinner every night, she said, her accent thick with emotion. She says you make her feel brave. Do you know how long I've waited to hear my daughter say she feels brave? Meanwhile, across town, Malik and his riders were conducting their own kind of support circle, one built on decades of street wisdom and unshakable loyalty. They worked in shifts, following leads, documenting patterns. Rico, whose memory for details had once kept them all alive during their rougher days, kept meticulous notes. Maddox meets 3 other officers behind the Walmart every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, he reported. They exchange packages. Nothing official about it. Jake, still sharp-eyed at 55, had photographed license plates and faces. Got clear shots of them unloading boxes at that warehouse on Pine Street, he said, spreading the pictures across Malik's workbench. Military-grade stuff, from what I can tell. The evidence mounted day by day. Supply drops at odd hours, conversations overheard in parking lots, money changing hands behind gas stations. The militia's operation was extensive, but they were getting sloppy, too confident in their power to be careful. On Wednesday evening, Zahara came home carrying a stack of papers tied with rainbow yarn. Her eyes were bright with happy tears as she showed them to Malik. The kids made these today, she said, untying the bundle. They're thank you notes. Malik sat at the kitchen table, carefully reading each childish scrawl. The words were simple but powerful. Thank you for making me feel important. Marcus, you helped me be strong. Amira, you're the nicest teacher ever and I'm not scared anymore. Elena Malik's hands trembled slightly as he read. A tear rolled down his weathered cheek, catching in his beard. Zahara pretended not to notice, busying herself with making tea, giving him space to feel the full weight of what his daughter had accomplished. You're doing good work, baby girl, he finally said, his voice rough with pride. Real good work. They were just sitting down to a late dinner, chicken stir-fry that had gotten cold while they read the notes, when the television in the living room caught their attention. Breaking news! The announcer's voice carried a false gravity that made both father and daughter freeze. Local teacher under investigation for endangering students. Zahara Carter, a substitute teacher at Oak Ridge Elementary, is being investigated following allegations of conducting unauthorized counseling sessions with minors. The fork in Zahara's hand clattered against her plate. She stared at the screen, where her school ID photo was displayed next to the scrolling headline. Her face, which usually carried such warmth, looked harsh and suspicious under the news station's graphics. Malik's expression transformed. The gentle father vanished, replaced by something colder, harder, the shadow of Hellhound rising in his eyes. His hands, resting on the table, curled into fists so tight the knuckles went white. The news anchor continued reading accusations that were so clearly false, so obviously manufactured, that they would have been laughable if they weren't so dangerous. They painted her support circle as unauthorized therapy sessions and suggested she was manipulating vulnerable children. They're coming after me now, Zahara said quietly. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water, creating ripples that would change everything. Malik reached for the burner phone in his pocket. His hand was shaking. not with fear but with a rage so profound it made his entire body tremble. The old flip phone, a relic from his past life, suddenly felt like a loaded weapon in his palm. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking the moment when their world shifted once again. The false accusations hung in the air like smoke, choking the peace they'd tried so hard to maintain. Their half-eaten dinner grew cold on the table, forgotten in the face of this new attack. Dawn crept over the neighborhood like a hesitant friend, unsure of its welcome. Zahara sat at her kitchen table, clutching a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The morning news played quietly in the background, repeating the accusations against her with a cruel persistence. Her phone buzzed. The school district's number flashed on the screen. With trembling fingers, she answered. "Miss Carter?" The administrator's voice was clipped, professional. "In light of recent allegations, you are suspended from teaching duties pending investigation. Please do not return to campus until further notice." The words hit her like physical blows. Suspended. Investigation. Do not return. Malik watched from across the room, his face a mask of contained fury. When she set the phone down, he stepped forward, but Zahara held up her hand. "I need air," she whispered. She walked out to the front porch, settling into the old wooden swing where she'd spent so many childhood afternoons. After a moment, Malik joined her, saying nothing but offering his solid presence. The morning air was cool against her face, carrying the scent of Mrs. Rodriguez's roses from next door. A car door slammed nearby. Then another. And another. Elena's grandmother was the first to approach, clutching a handwritten letter. "My Elena," she said, her voice shaking. "She cried when she heard the news. She told me everything, how you help the children stand up to bullies, how you teach them to be proud of who they are. We know the truth, Miss Carter." Before Zahara could respond, Mr. Johnson, a Vietnam veteran who lived 3 houses down, came walking up with his daughter and grandchildren. "My grandson Marcus was failing everything before you started helping him," he said firmly. "Now he's getting B's. They can't shut you down for caring." More people arrived. Parents, grandparents, veterans, from the local VFW hall. Each carried stories of how Zahara had touched their families' lives. Mrs. Thompson, whose daughter had stopped speaking after being bullied, explained how Zahara's support circle had given her child her voice back. "We're not letting them do this to you," said Mr. Peterson, a retired high school principal. He pulled out a tablet. "I started an online petition last night. Want to see how many signatures we've got?" Zahara leaned forward, her eyes widening as she saw the numbers. 312 signatures. Then, as she watched, it jumped to 315. 318. The community was rallying in real time. By early afternoon, the petition had over 500 signatures. The local news vans that had shown up hoping to catch scandal footage instead captured something entirely different. A neighborhood united, standing on Zahara's front lawn, sharing stories of her impact on their children's lives. Malik's phone buzzed. It was Rico. "Boss," he said quietly, "we got something big. Really big." While Zahara had been building trust with her students, Malik and his riders had been building a case. Rico and Jake had documented dozens of suspicious meetings. They'd photographed evidence of evidence tampering, recorded conversations about manipulated police reports. The militia's corruption ran deep, touching everything from minor traffic stops to major criminal investigations. The school board called at 4 o'clock. The chairman's voice was notably less confident than it had been that morning. "Miss Carter," he said, clearing his throat, "in light of significant community response, we've decided to hold a formal hearing. You'll have the opportunity to present your side of the story." After the crowd finally dispersed, Zahara sat with Malik in their living room. The setting sun painted the walls in warm amber. a gentle ending to a tumultuous day. "I keep thinking about Elena," Zahara said softly. "Remember how she wouldn't look anyone in the eye when school started? Today her grandmother told me she's joining the debate club." Malik reached over and took his daughter's hand. "You know what I see when I look at you?" he asked. "I see your mama's heart. She had that same way of touching lives without making a fuss about it. You were changing lives long before any of this happened, baby girl. This accusation? It just helped people see what was already there." Tears welled in Zahara's eyes. "I'm scared, Daddy," she whispered, using the name she hadn't called him since she was small. "What if they win?" Malik pulled her close, just as he had when she was a little girl, afraid of thunderstorms. "They won't," he said firmly. "You've got something they'll never understand. Real love. Not the kind that makes noise, but the kind that changes things from the inside out. The kind that makes little girls join debate clubs and boys start getting B's instead of F's." They sat together in the such growing darkness, father and daughter, each drawing strength from the other. Finally, exhaustion overtook Zahara. She kissed her father's cheek and headed upstairs to bed, her steps a little steadier than they had been that morning. Malik watched her go, pride and worry warring in his heart. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text message from an unknown number. "They know you're digging." The autumn evening wrapped the neighborhood in long shadows as Malik drove his pickup down the familiar streets toward home. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with everything they'd discovered over the past 24 hours. Just that morning, Rico and Jake had positioned themselves near the abandoned Maxwell warehouse on the edge of town. The derelict building, with its broken windows and crumbling brick, had become a meeting spot for Maddox and his militia cohorts. Using a long-range camera, they'd captured clear footage of Maddox shaking hands with known militia leaders, passing folders back and forth, plotting in plain sight because they thought no one was watching. "This is it, boss," Rico had said, showing Malik the footage. "We got them. Clear as day." The evidence they'd gathered was damning. Documentation of tampered police reports, audio recordings of threats, photographs of illegal weapons exchanges, and now, finally, video proof of the corruption reaching to the highest levels of local law enforcement. Malik turned onto Cedar Creek Road, a quiet back route he often took to avoid traffic. The sun had nearly set, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. He allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, to feel a glimmer of hope. With this much evidence, they could finally expose the whole operation. They could protect Zahara. They could. Red and blue lights suddenly flooded his rearview mirror. Malik's heart dropped as he saw 2 police cruisers racing up behind him. He began to pull over, but another car appeared ahead, blocking his path. They had him boxed in. The squad cars surrounded his truck, trapping him on the narrow road. Malik's hands tightened on the wheel as he watched Officer Trent Maddox step out of the lead vehicle, that familiar smirk twisting his face. "Well, well," Maddox drawled, approaching the driver's side window. "If it isn't the concerned citizen himself." "What's this about?" Malik asked, keeping his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Maddox ordered, his hand resting meaningfully on his weapon. "We have a report of you assaulting an officer during a traffic dispute earlier today." "That's a lie and you know it," Malik said quietly. "Are you resisting arrest?" Maddox's smirk widened. "Because that would be unfortunate." Malik could see the other officers' hands on their weapons. He knew this game. They were hoping he'd give them an excuse. With deliberate calm, he opened his door and stepped out. "Hands where we can see." "Them!" Maddox barked. Malik raised his hands slowly, his mind racing. Everything they'd gathered, all the evidence, it was hidden safely with Rico. Even if they searched his truck, they wouldn't find anything. But that wasn't really what this was about. Maddox roughly grabbed Malik's wrists, snapping handcuffs around them too tight. "You should have minded your own business," he hissed in Malik's ear. "Some people just don't know their place." The sound of squealing tires made them both look up. Zahara's small blue car had just skidded to a stop at the end of the road. She must have heard the sirens, must have known something was wrong. "Daddy!" she screamed, jumping out of her car. "Stop! What are you doing? He hasn't done anything." "Stay back, miss," one of the other officers warned, as Zahara tried to run forward. Maddox's grip tightened painfully on Malik's arm. "Tell your daddy next time he should stay in his place," he called out to Zahara, loud enough for everyone to hear the threat beneath the words. As they began forcing him toward the squad car, Malik locked eyes with his daughter. She looked so much like her mother in that moment, the same fire, the same unwavering strength beneath the fear. "Finish this," he managed to whisper as they pushed his head down. "Your way." The car door slammed shut. Through the window, Malik watched Zahara collapse to her knees in the middle of the road, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The red and blue lights painted her crumpled form in alternating colors as the squad cars pulled away, taking Malik into darkness. His last glimpse was of his baby girl getting smaller in the distance, alone on that quiet back road as her world shattered around her. The image burned itself into his mind. Zahara kneeling in the gravel, shoulders bent but not broken, as the lights faded and the night closed in. In that moment, despite his fear and rage, Malik felt a fierce pride cut through his despair. Because even as they took him away, even as Maddox thought he'd won, Malik knew something the corrupt officer didn't. Zahara had her mother's heart, but she had his fire. And she would not let this stand. The squad cars accelerated into the gathering dark, carrying Malik away from everything he loved, leaving his daughter alone in the growing shadows of an autumn evening that had started with such hope and ended in despair. The kitchen clock ticked relentlessly through the dark hours, each second echoing in the hollow silence of the house. Zahara sat motionless at the wooden table where she and her father had shared countless meals, her eyes fixed on his empty chair. The untouched mug of coffee in front of her had long since gone cold. She hadn't moved since returning home after watching the police cars disappear into the night with her father. Her phone buzzed occasionally with messages from concerned friends, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. The weight of helplessness pressed down on her chest until it felt hard to breathe. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when a gentle knock broke through her daze. 3 soft taps, the familiar rhythm of Miss Lorraine from next door. Zahara didn't respond, but a moment later she heard the spare key turning in the lock. The door creaked open, bringing with it the warm smell of fresh-baked biscuits. "Oh, baby girl," Miss Lorraine's voice was soft as she took in Zahara's red-rimmed eyes and slumped shoulders. The elderly woman set down a cloth-covered basket and pulled out the chair next to Zahara, easing her aging frame into it with a quiet sigh. She didn't say anything else, just reached over and covered Zahara's cold hand with her warm one. The simple touch of comfort broke something in Zahara. Words began pouring out between choking sobs, everything that had happened since that first encounter with Officer Maddox, her father's revealed past, the false accusations against her, and finally Malik's arrest. Miss Lorraine listened without interruption, her weathered hand steadily holding Zahara's trembling one. "They took him," Zahara finally whispered, her voice raw. "They took my daddy just to prove they could, to punish us for standing up." Miss Lorraine was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes distant with memories. "You know," she said finally, "I was just a little younger than you during the sit-ins. I remember watching good people get dragged away by police who thought their badges gave them the right to hurt us." She squeezed Zahara's hand. But here's what I learned then, and what I still believe now. Light defeats darkness only when it refuses to dim. Zahara lifted her tear-stained face, really looking at Miss Lorraine for the first time that morning. The older woman's eyes were bright with a fierce kind of hope. "Your daddy," Miss Lorraine continued, "he's been fighting this battle his way, in the shadows, gathering proof. But maybe that's not how this needs to end. Maybe what's needed now is something those men don't expect, the light of day and a community standing together." The words settled into Zahara's heart, awakening something that had been dormant since her father's arrest. She straightened in her chair, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "The writers," she said suddenly. "Daddy's old friends. They have all the evidence." Miss Lorraine nodded, already reaching for her phone. "You want me to call them for you?" "No." Zahara stood up, her legs shaky but holding. "I need to do this myself." She paused, then bent to hug the older woman tightly. "Thank you, Miss Lorraine, for everything." "I'll stay and make you a proper breakfast," Miss Lorraine said firmly. "You'll need your strength today." The riders began arriving shortly after noon. They filed into the house quietly, their usual rough demeanor softened by concern for Malik's daughter. Rico, Malik's oldest friend, carried a heavy backpack that Zahara knew contained weeks of careful surveillance. "Your father never wanted you involved in this part," Rico said hesitantly when Zahara asked to see everything they'd gathered. The other riders shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain looks. "I know," Zahara met Rico's eyes steadily. "But he's not here to protect me anymore, and I'm done being afraid." After a long moment, Rico nodded. He unzipped the backpack and began laying out folders, USB drives, and notebooks across the kitchen table. "Everything's here: photos of militia meetings, recorded conversations, financial records showing bribes, testimony from other officers who were threatened into silence." Zahara spent hours sorting through it all, organizing the evidence into clear categories, while Miss Lorraine kept her supplied with sweet tea and the riders added context to each piece. As the sun began to set, she started seeing patterns emerge, connections between seemingly unrelated incidents that painted a picture of systematic corruption and abuse of power. Videos showed Maddox and other officers meeting with known militia members. Financial records revealed suspicious payments. Written testimonies from intimidated witnesses formed a timeline of escalating violence and discrimination. But what struck Zahara most were the photographs, dozens of faces of community members who had been harmed or silenced by the militia's influence. She spread everything out on the living room floor as night fell, surrounded by proof of years of injustice. The riders watched silently as she began drafting a plan on a large piece of paper, her handwriting growing more confident with each line. "We can't fight them in the shadows anymore," she said finally, looking up at the circle of concerned faces. "That's their territory. We need to bring this into the light, all of it, all at once. And not just the evidence, but the people. Every person who's been hurt, every story they tried to silence." Rico knelt beside her, studying her notes. "What exactly are you thinking?" "A community testimony." Zahara's voice grew stronger as she explained. "Not just filing reports or sending evidence to internal affairs. We gather everyone: parents, grandparents, veterans, students, all the people who've been afraid to speak up alone. We bring them together, in public, with cameras and media present. Let them tell their stories while we present the evidence. Make it too big, too visible, for anyone to ignore or cover up." The riders exchanged looks, something like respect dawning in their eyes. This wasn't Malik's careful strategy of gathering intelligence from the shadows. This was something bolder, brighter, a daughter's way of finishing what her father had started. As midnight approached, Zahara sat at her father's desk, finalizing lists of contacts and drafting messages to community leaders. The evidence was spread out around her, but she wasn't looking at it anymore. Instead, her eyes were fixed on a framed photo of her and Malik from her college graduation. His proud smile gave her strength. "I'll bring you home, Daddy," she whispered, picking up her phone to begin making calls. "And I'll do it by bringing everything they've done into the light." Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and purples as Zahara stood before her mirror, carefully adjusting the bright yellow scarf that had once belonged to her mother. The silky fabric felt both foreign and familiar between her fingers. She remembered seeing photos of her mother wearing it during civil rights marches in the 1980s, her head held high and proud. "This feels right," she whispered, smoothing the scarf one final time. Her reflection showed a woman transformed, not by anger or fear, but by quiet determination. She began her day in the older part of town, where Miss Jenkins, a grandmother of 3, welcomed her with tears in her eyes. They sat in a small kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and coffee, while Miss Jenkins described how the militia had threatened her grandson after he witnessed them planting evidence. "I've been scared to speak up," Miss Jenkins admitted, wringing her weathered hands. "But seeing you stand tall after what they did to you and your daddy, well, that changes things." House by house, story by story, Zahara built her coalition of truth tellers. A veteran shared how the militia had vandalized his small business when he refused to pay for protection. A young mother described being harassed during routine traffic stops. Each person's pain was different, yet connected by the same thread of injustice. Rico and 2 other riders followed at a distance in their trucks, keeping watch while helping coordinate transportation plans for those who agreed to testify. They communicated through text messages, their presence providing silent support as Zahara moved through the community. By late afternoon, the sun hung low and heavy in the sky. Zahara's feet ached from walking, but her spirit soared. 23 people had agreed to speak out. 23 voices ready to shine light into dark places. "Your daddy would be proud," Rico said quietly when they regrouped. "This ain't his way of doing things, but maybe your way is better." Zahara nodded, thinking of her father's strength, now transformed through her into something new. "We need somewhere safe to gather," she said. "Somewhere big enough for everyone, but protected." "The First Baptist Church," Rico suggested. "Pastor Matthews has known your daddy for years." The church stood like a sentinel in the fading light, its white steeple reaching toward the darkening sky. Pastor Matthews welcomed Zahara into his office, listening intently as she laid out her plan. His kind face grew serious as she showed him some of the evidence. "This is dangerous work you're doing," he said finally, "but necessary work, holy work even." He stood and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The church will open its doors. We'll make sure everyone who speaks has a safe space to do so." Relief washed over Zahara like a warm wave. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed this blessing, this sanctuary for truth. Together they worked out logistics for the gathering: security, seating, support for those who might need it while sharing difficult stories. Later that night, Zahara stood alone on the church steps, the streetlights casting long shadows across the worn stones. The folder she held contained evidence that could change everything: photos, testimonies, financial records that proved the militia's corruption. But more than that, it held people's trust, their courage, their hope for justice. She pressed the folder close to her heart, feeling its weight, not just of paper and ink, but of responsibility and promise. The night air was cool against her face as she looked up at the stars, thinking of her father in his cell, of her mother's bright scarf, of all the people who had opened their doors and hearts to her today. "This is for you, Daddy," she whispered into the quiet night, her words carrying all the love and determination of a daughter's heart. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of autumn day that painted the sky a perfect, hopeful blue. By 9 o'clock, more than 200 people had gathered outside City Hall, their presence transforming the usually quiet plaza into a sea of determined faces. Zahara's heart swelled as she looked at the crowd. Miss Jenkins stood near the front, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. Next to her, the veteran who'd lost his business held a sign that read, "End Police Corruption." Students from her support circle clustered together, wearing yellow ribbons that matched her mother's scarf. "Ready?" Rico asked softly, standing beside her with a laptop containing all the evidence. Zahara took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." They filed into the council chamber, filling every seat and lining the walls. The council members shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for such a massive turnout. Zahara approached the podium, her hands steady as she adjusted the microphone. "My name is Zahara Carter," she began, her voice clear and strong. 3 weeks ago, Officer Trent Maddox stopped me without cause, destroyed my bicycle, and humiliated me in front of my students. She described that day in detail, not hiding the pain but refusing to let it overwhelm her. "But this isn't just about me. This is about every person in our community who has suffered in silence." Rico connected the laptop to the projector. Images filled the screen behind her, surveillance photos, financial documents, recorded meetings. Gasps echoed through the chamber as evidence of the militia's corruption became impossible to ignore. Then, one by one, people began to speak. "They threatened my grandson," Miss Jenkins testified, her voice shaking but determined. "They vandalized my store when I wouldn't pay protection money," the veteran declared. A teenage boy described being harassed on his way to school. A nurse spoke about witnessing evidence tampering at the hospital, each story built upon the last, creating an undeniable picture of systemic abuse. Reporters who had initially come for a routine council meeting scrambled to record everything. Phones buzzed as news alerts went out. By noon, the story had gone viral, and federal authorities were downloading the evidence Zahara had carefully compiled. At 2 o'clock, FBI vehicles surrounded the militia's compound. Agents in dark jackets moved swiftly, their actions decisive and coordinated. Officer Maddox was led out in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage. 5 other officers followed, along with several militia members. Zahara received the call at 4:37 in the afternoon. "Your father's being released," Rico told her, his voice thick with emotion. "They're processing him now." She rushed to the county jail, her heart pounding. The crowd from City Hall had regathered, forming a supportive circle around the entrance. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, the heavy doors opened. Malik stepped out, blinking in the golden light. For a moment, he looked uncertain, as if he couldn't quite believe his freedom was real. Then his eyes found Zahara. She ran to him, throwing herself into his arms. He caught her, holding her tight as cheers erupted around them. Tears streamed down both their faces as they clung to each other. "You did it, baby girl," Malik whispered into her hair, his voice full of pride and love. "You won." The crowd's applause washed over them like a wave of joy and vindication. In that moment, wrapped in her father's arms with her mother's scarf still around her shoulders, Zahara felt the full weight of their victory. She had faced darkness with light, fought hatred with truth, and proven that one voice speaking up could inspire hundreds to follow. The morning after Malik's release brought sunshine that seemed brighter somehow, its warmth touching everything with renewed promise. Zahara stood at her bedroom window, watching the light paint golden patterns across her father's workshop. The air felt different, lighter, cleaner, full of possibility. Her phone buzzed with an email from the school board. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, but her eyes quickly filled with happy tears. Not only was she fully reinstated, but they had created a new position just for her. District Coordinator of Equity and Community Relations. The role would allow her to expand her support circle into a district-wide program, helping countless more students and families. "Dad!" she called out, running downstairs. "Dad, look at this!" Malik was already in the kitchen, making pancakes, a tradition from her childhood that felt especially meaningful this morning. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and read the email, his face breaking into a proud smile. "This is exactly what our community needs," he said, pulling her into a warm hug. "And exactly what you were meant to do." Later that morning, Malik gathered his writers in the workshop. The space that had recently housed their investigation was now being transformed. Tools were organized, old parts sorted, and donated bikes lined up against the wall. A fresh sign hung above the door. Zahara's Wheels of Hope. "Every kid deserves the joy of riding," Malik explained to the group, "and every kid deserves to feel safe doing it." The riders, these tough men with weathered faces and gentle hearts, nodded in agreement. They had already volunteered to serve as mentors, teaching basic repairs and bike safety to neighborhood youth. Throughout the day, families stopped by. A mother brought homemade tamales to thank them for speaking up. A grandfather came with his grandson to donate outgrown bikes. Each visitor shared stories, not of fear anymore, but of hope. Miss Lorraine appeared with her famous lemon squares, beaming as she watched Malik teach 2 young boys how to change a bike tire. "Look at what your light started," she said to Zahara, squeezing her hand. The weekend brought perfect weather for the community fair organized in their honor. The local park buzzed with activity, food vendors, music, and dozens of children testing out their newly repaired bikes. Zahara watched a little girl wobble past on training wheels, her father running alongside her, and felt her heart swell with joy. Rico and the other riders had set up a repair station, patiently showing kids how to oil change and adjust seat heights. They wore new t-shirts with the Zahara's Wheels of Hope logo, looking more like proud uncles than the fierce bikers they'd once been. As the afternoon wore on, Zahara and Malik took a slow walk through the fair together. People stopped them every few steps to express gratitude or share a kind word. Malik's hand rested on her shoulder, steady and proud, as they watched their community celebrate not just their victory, but the power of their own united voice. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across the park. Zahara sat on a bench, watching the last few kids circle on their bikes. Her mother's scarf fluttered gently in the evening breeze. "What are you thinking about?" Malik asked, settling beside her. Zahara smiled, feeling the deep truth of her words. "I'm thinking about how we won, not with fists or threats or violence, but with something stronger. We won with compassion, with courage, with hope." She looked at the families around them, at the riders teaching bike safety, at the children laughing freely. "We won by bringing light to the darkness, by standing together, by refusing to let fear win." Malik wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and they sat in comfortable silence as the day's golden light faded into dusk. The air filled with the sounds of happy goodbyes, of bikes being loaded into cars, of community members making plans to return tomorrow. In that peaceful moment, Zahara felt the full circle of their journey, from broken bikes to broken systems, from fear to courage, from isolation to unity. The victory hadn't come from matching hatred with hatred or violence with violence. It had come from the quiet strength of truth, from the power of compassion, and from the unshakable force of a community that had found its voice and its hope in the darkest of times. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.